I want to start with a single line from a manorial survey. Not a theory, not a map, not a revelation. One line, it comes from a 14th century estate record from the Cotswold Hills in central England. The kind of document that survives because it was practical, not because anyone considered it significant. A steward cataloguing the assets of a lord's estate for tax purposes. Livestock, grain stores, field measurements, tenancy arrangements, mill rights. A list. And in the middle of that list, between an entry about a fish pond and an entry about a dovecote, this. Of the coppice adjoining the east field, the tenants have always gathered pears and crabstock and service berries in autumn, and no man remembers who planted them nor when, and this has been so for as long as there is record. I sat with that line for a long time. No man remembers who planted them, in a document designed to account for every asset on an estate, an orchard, because that is functionally what is being described, existing in a forested area with no planting record, no establishing owner, no origin. Producing food, reliably enough to appear in a tax survey as a resource worth noting, for longer than any living memory or prior record could reach. I filed it. Then 6 months later, a similar note, different archive, different country, different language. A 15th century inventory from a Burgundian estate describing fruit-bearing trees in managed woodland, actively harvested by tenants with no recorded history of establishment. Nobody planted them, nobody owned them, they were simply producing, as if they had always been producing, as if the landscape itself had decided to feed the people who lived in it. This is how the pattern always begins, with a line, with a margin note in a document so ordinary that whoever wrote it didn't appear to find it remarkable at all. And that ordinariness, I have come to believe, is exactly what matters. What is ordinary enough to record without comment is almost always the most important thing on the page. It means the writer assumed the reader knew what it meant. It means it was common enough not to explain. The deeper I went into manorial records, forestry surveys, court rolls, estate inventories, and early botanical literature from across northern and western Europe, the more of these notes I found. Different regions, different centuries, different political systems, but always the same essential structure. Fruit-bearing trees in ancient woodland with no planting history. Communities gathering from them, nobody asking who made them because the question, apparently, didn't occur to anyone to ask. What I think I found, across 2 years of following this thread, is evidence that beneath the official account of medieval European food production, the subsistence farms, the feudal estates, the wilderness as backdrop to human civilization, there was another system. Older than feudalism, older than the manorial system that first wrote it down, already producing when the settlements around it were built. A system that, beginning in the 16th century and continuing through the 19th, was enclosed, reclassified and removed from common access with a thoroughness and a speed that left most of the populations who had depended on it without the vocabulary to describe what they had lost. The trees are still there, some of them, still producing. Nobody is allowed near the oldest parts of them, and the reasons given for that restriction deserve more scrutiny than they have received. If you've been following this series, you'll recognize the shape of what I'm describing. We've seen it in Białowieża in Yakushima, in the Amazon basin, but here the evidence is in European languages, in accessible archives, on land you could drive to this afternoon. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The difference this time is that what was removed was not a remote wilderness. It was, for centuries, dinner. Let me give you the official version first, because it matters enormously that we understand exactly what we were taught before we examine what the physical and documentary evidence actually shows. The official story of medieval European food production is a story of controlled scarcity. Small strip fields ploughed annually by tenant farmers who owed a portion of everything they produced to the lord of the manor. Seasonal hunger, the winter months as a period of deprivation between the autumn harvest and the spring sowing. The forest in this story is peripheral, a source of timber and fuel, a hunting ground reserved to the nobility, a space of danger and wildness beyond the managed agricultural perimeter. Common people lived at the boundary between the managed and the wild. They gleaned what the harvest left, They gathered berries and mushrooms in the margins, but the wilderness was wilderness. It fed nobody reliably. It was backdrop, not system. That story is internally consistent. It has a very large evidentiary base. I am not suggesting it's fabricated, I'm suggesting it's incomplete, and the incompleteness is located in precisely what it says about the forests. Here is where the official story begins to crack. In 1217, 8 years after Magna Carta, the English Crown issued a second foundational document called the Charter of the Forest. It is far less famous than its companion, but historians who study it argue, reasonably, that it was more immediately significant to the daily lives of ordinary people. What the Charter guaranteed was the right of common people to access resources from the royal forests. And the resources it specifies are remarkably precise. Pannage, the right to release pigs into the forest in autumn to forage en masse, the collective term for acorns, beechnuts and other fallen tree fruit. Mast rights as a standalone entitlement. Estovers, the right to take wood for fuel and repair, and the right to gather fruit, not a vague right to wander, a specific named legally enshrined right to gather fruit from forests. You do not enshrine in a royal charter the right to gather fruit from forests unless people are, in fact, gathering fruit from forests, unless there is, in fact, fruit to gather, unless the fruit is significant enough to the food supply of common people that removing access to it would require political confrontation significant enough to justify a formal document. The Charter of the Forest is not aspirational legislation. It is a legal codification of practices already so embedded in daily life that they required formal protection against encroachment. People were eating from forests, in quantities that mattered, from forests that no one, in any prior documentary record, appears to have deliberately planted. But here is where the character of what they were eating matters, because the species recorded in manor court rolls, gleaning disputes, estate surveys and botanical inventories from across England, France, the Low Countries and the German principalities are not the random wild species you might expect from genuinely untended forest. They are, with remarkable regularity, the same list: crabapples, wild pear, sloe, elderberry, hawthorn, whose berries, called haws, were consumed in quantity in the pre-modern period in ways modern food culture has entirely lost sight of. Hazel, producing nuts that in a productive stand could provide meaningful caloric supplement across an autumn. And two species that do not belong in that list if the forest was genuinely wild and genuinely unmanaged: the service tree and the wild cherry. The service tree, Sorbus domestica, is among the most obscure woody species in British and European woodland. Most people in Britain have never seen one. It grows slowly. It is very long-lived. It produces a small fruit somewhere between a crab apple and a berry that becomes edible after bletting, a softening process triggered by the first hard frost, in the same way that medlars are edible only after freezing. In the pre-modern period, service fruits appear in estate accounts, in records of autumn gathering rites, and in early herbal literature with a regularity that is completely invisible in modern thinking about medieval food. People were eating these, consistently, in enough volume that they appear in legal documents about access rights. And the service tree's distribution in ancient European woodland is, by any ecological standard, anomalous. It does not spread readily by seed. Its fruit is not dispersed by birds in the reliable, wide-ranging way that berry species are. Its natural regeneration in genuinely unmanaged conditions is extremely low. Independent botanical surveys across southern England, Wales, the Ardennes, the Black Forest and the Apennines have found it growing in the oldest woodland sections in concentrations that natural dispersal rates cannot explain. It is there, in the old woodland, in the places people were eating from, in concentrations that require an alternative explanation. The official explanation is that historical planting by medieval landowners accounts for the distribution, and for trees found close to documented estate centres that is probably correct. But for the trees in the interior sections of old-growth woodland, furthest from any known estate management in areas that manor records describe as accessed by commoners rather than cultivated by lords, The historical planting explanation fails to specify who planted them, when, and why. Management history unknown. That phrase appears in the botanical literature on ancient woodland species assemblages more often than I am comfortable with, not as a placeholder awaiting further research. As a terminal notation, the inquiry stops there. Now we leave England and we go south, because the most substantial evidence for what I'm trying to describe exists not in British hedgerows, but in the forests of the Mediterranean fringe. Corsica, Sardinia, the Cevennes Plateau in southern France, Calabria in the deep south of Italy. These regions share a single ecological fact that the tourism literature mentions briefly, and the agricultural history literature has never, in my experience, examined with the weight it deserves. Chestnut forests. Ancient, enormous, extraordinarily productive chestnut forests. The sweet chestnut, Castanea sativa, produces nuts in quantities that per acre in a well-established stand are comparable to cereal grain yields. It does not require annual ploughing or replanting. An established chestnut tree produces reliably for centuries. Documented cases exist of individual trees still yielding abundantly after over 1,000 years. The nut is calorie dense, stores well across a winter, and processes into flour for bread and polenta. In Corsica, the chestnut was called l'arbre à pain, the bread tree. This was not a figure of speech. For centuries, the interior populations of Corsica subsisted primarily on chestnut products. The island's pre-modern population densities in areas with no significant grain agriculture are only coherent if the chestnut forest was doing the caloric work of farmland. And here is the question that the standard historical account of these regions has never answered to my satisfaction. Who planted these forests? The sweet chestnut, Castanea sativa, is not native to Corsica, Sardinia, or significant portions of the territory where it now dominates ancient woodland. Its native range, as determined by pollen core analysis and genetic mapping, is limited to specific refugia in the eastern Mediterranean and parts of Anatolia. The presence of vast ancient food-productive chestnut forests across the western Mediterranean islands and mainland southern Europe requires an explanation that goes beyond natural range expansion. The Roman Empire is the standard answer. Roman sources mention the chestnut. There is documentary evidence of Roman cultivation and deliberate spread of the species as part of their agricultural infrastructure. The argument is coherent. I don't dismiss it. But the Roman explanation encounters a specific distribution problem. The oldest chestnut stands in these regions, those with the largest girths, those the available dating evidence places at the older end of the spectrum, are not concentrated near Roman roads, near Roman settlement archaeology, near the known infrastructure of Roman agricultural expansion. Some are. The correlation exists in some areas and is real, but some of the oldest, densest, most isolated chestnut forests are in exactly the places where Roman agricultural infrastructure was sparse or absent, in high-altitude interiors, in areas whose documented contact with Roman systems was limited to trading relationships rather than direct land management. These stands predate, or appear to predate, the Roman presence in those territories. And the official literature, when it encounters this, notes it briefly and moves on. The inquiry stops at the edge of what Rome can explain. The question of what those trees were doing there before Rome arrived is left standing in silence. That stopping point has always troubled me. Let me bring in a specific document, because this story becomes difficult to dismiss when it appears in the handwriting of a working surveyor with no apparent theoretical agenda. In 1714, a Württemberg forestry official conducting one of the first systematic interior surveys of the Black Forest, the Schwarzwald, which had by that point been largely inaccessible to agricultural settlement for several centuries, recorded an observation that appears once in his survey report without elaboration, and is not, as far as I have been able to determine, cited in any subsequent literature. He describes entering a section of old-growth forest at elevation and finding what he calls, in his German, ein angebauter Bäume von hohem Alter, a grove of cultivated trees of great age. He notes the trees are not of a single species. He notes they bear fruit, and he notes, with a precision I find in retrospect extraordinary, that the trees appear to have been selected, his word, because they do not all bear at the same time, but in succession across the season, as if to provide continuously, rather than all at once. Read that slowly. A grove of cultivated trees, great age, selected for varietal diversity, bearing in succession across the season. In the interior of a forest so remote it had not been systematically mapped until 1714. No planting record, no adjacent estate, no explanation offered. The surveyor records it and moves on because his task was inventory, not history. But the inventory contains that line, and that line is not the description of a wild forest. It is the description of a designed system. A system designed for exactly what a well-planned orchard is designed for. Continuous season-long harvest, achieved through deliberate varietal selection. Not a single peak harvest monoculture. A succession system. Someone built that, and built it well enough that it was still running in 1714, unmaintained, in the interior of a forest that had been functionally inaccessible for generations. Let me name what I think is the single most important structural fact in everything I've been examining. It is not any individual archive. It is not any individual species anomaly. It is the timing of what happened to these systems, and specifically, when it happened. Between roughly 1550 and 1850, with notable intensity in the late 18th and early 19th century, something happened across every major European political system within the same compressed window: the enclosure of the commons. In England, Parliament passed thousands of individual enclosure acts. The count exceeds 5,000 by the most thorough assessments, that progressively converted land held in common, used in common, and producing for common access into private property. The Charter of the Forest Rights, the pannage, the mass gathering, the fruit access legally protected since 1217, were one by one revoked, bought out, legislated away. The commons were fenced, the forests were reclassified, the practices were ended, and the trees kept growing, behind the new fences, still bearing. Available to nobody. England's enclosure movement is the most documented, but the pattern extends across the continent in ways that the synchronization problem demands we examine. In France, the revolution that dismantled the feudal system did not restore common forest access. It reorganized it into state control. The Napoleonic land reforms and ultimately the Code Forestier of 1827 imposed state ownership and management on forests that had been collectively accessed by village communities across France for documented centuries. Contemporaries wrote about this. Their accounts described the loss not in legal terms but in food terms. What they lost, they said, was the ability to eat from the forest, not metaphorically, practically. In the German states, the Allmende system takes the collective common lands, the managed forests and meadows that had sustained village economies, was progressively enclosed through administrative reform driven by Enlightenment-era rationalization of land management. Different legal tradition, different political structure, same outcome: common forest access removed. The systems that had fed people from time beyond record were brought under private or state control. In the Habsburg Empire, equivalent reforms followed equivalent timelines. Different political system, different language, different legal framework. Same decision, same window. This is the coordination problem. And the coordination problem doesn't have an official explanation that I find adequate. The intellectual diffusion argument holds that ideas about enclosure, about privatization and rational land management travel between legal scholars, agricultural reformers and political administrators. Ideas do travel, I accept that, but ideas don't typically produce outcomes this synchronized across competing political systems whose agricultural traditions and relationships to common land varied enormously. Britain and France were rivals in this period. The German principalities and the Habsburg Empire were in complex political tension. They were not coordinating agricultural policy, and yet they arrived at nearly identical decisions about nearly identical kinds of land within the same century. What was producing that convergence? I am not in a position to name it definitively. I want to be honest about the limits of what the evidence shows. What I can describe is the outcome. Across every major European political system within roughly the same 100 years, common access to the unplanted, unmapped, unaccounted forest food systems I've been describing was removed, and within 1 to 2 generations of that removal, the populations who had eaten from these systems stopped knowing they had ever existed. Because you cannot describe a food source you cannot reach, and what you cannot reach, you eventually forget how to see. There is a detail I want to bring in here because it connects what I'm describing to the sequence of events that followed in the most direct possible way. In the 1840s, Europe experienced catastrophic famine. The Irish case is the most documented and the most extreme, but it was not isolated. Highland Scotland starved. Parts of Belgium, the German Rhineland, Scandinavia, the 1840s are called, in the historiography of European food systems, the Hungry Forties. They represent the most widespread food crisis in Western Europe since the medieval period. The standard explanation focuses on potato blight and monoculture failure. These factors are real. I don't dispute them. But here is the question I cannot find a satisfying answer to in the official literature on this period. If Europe in the early 19th century still had access to the forest food systems that the manorial records, the gleaning rights, the Charter of the Forest, and the estate surveys all describe as having sustained populations across previous periods of agricultural difficulty, if the unplanted orchards and chestnut forests and hedgerow systems were still accessible in the decades before the blight arrived, how did populations that had relied on these systems as a buffer through previous failures starve at the scale they did? The enclosure movement peaked in the late 18th and early 19th century. The famines came in the generation immediately following. I am not claiming a simple causal chain. The evidence doesn't permit that precision, but the sequence matters. The proximate cause of the famines, blight, monoculture failure, market disruption, receives enormous scholarly attention. The question of what forest food buffer had been legally removed in the decades immediately preceding the blight has received almost none. The official literature does not ask what was enclosed before the potato failed. The official explanation collapses here, not because it misidentifies the blight, but because it never looks behind the blight at what was already gone. I want to be careful about what I am and am not claiming. I am not arguing these systems were the deliberate product of a single civilization with a master plan. I am not naming architects or administrators. I am not suggesting the enclosure movement was a coordinated conspiracy to remove biological knowledge from ordinary people, though the outcomes would be entirely consistent with such a plan. What I am arguing is this: the evidence, the species distribution anomalies, the sequential bearing grove in the 1714 Black Forest Survey, the service tree concentrations in ancient woodland across multiple countries, the chestnut forests that predate the civilization credited with establishing them, the manorial records describing sustained production from systems with no known planting history, points toward the existence of intentional, very old designed food production systems embedded in what we now call European ancient woodland. Systems accessed for centuries under the names of gleaning rights and pannage and mass rights without anyone apparently thinking to ask who built them, because they were simply there, had always been there, were as unremarkable as the ground they grew from. Systems removed in a synchronized movement across competing political systems within a historically compressed window. And after that removal, the trees kept growing. The orchard the 14th century Cotswold steward described, where no man remembered who planted them, is still there in fragments of ancient woodland that survived enclosure. In the oldest, least disturbed sections, In the hedgerows of Devon and Cornwall, whose species composition implies establishment beyond the reach of any known planting record, whose management history is officially classed as unknown. In the chestnut forests of Corsica that predate the civilization credited with introducing them. In whatever remains of the old growth interior where a surveyor in 1714 found trees selected to bear in succession, and filed the observation without follow-up because his job was the inventory, not the question. Still bearing, still sequential, still following a program we didn't write and don't understand. I've spent a long time on this, longer perhaps than the evidence strictly requires, and here is what I keep returning to. Not to the question of who designed these systems, though that question deserves serious attention. Not to the question of what knowledge tradition selected fruit tree varieties for succession bearing across a season, and embedded that selection into a forest old enough that by the 18th century it appeared entirely wild. Though that question deserves far more attention than it has received, I keep returning to what happened when the access was removed. The hunger followed, and to one quieter question underneath that, whether the people who enclosed the commons and the forests and the chestnut groves and the unplanted orchards did so because they wanted the land, which is the official answer and is probably partly true, or because they understood at some level, clearly or dimly, what those systems actually were, what they were carrying forward, whose design they were expressing without anyone left to name the designer. The service trees are still in the old woodland. Nobody is gathering the fruit. The chestnut forests are still on the hillsides above the Severn, in the oldest sections, still producing. Somewhere in the Black Forest, if the 1714 survey can be trusted, there is a grove of trees someone selected to feed people across an entire season, still bearing in succession, still following a varietal pattern someone chose deliberately for a purpose that no living person has ever fully explained. No man remembers who planted them. The question that stops me is not who it was, it is whether the people who decided that what those trees were doing should no longer be available to the people standing beneath them knew the answer to that question and chose not to say.